A Kingdom's Hidden Path. Paris, 1919. Elizabeth Garrison knew Major Nathaniel Blackwood was dead. But when she stopped at a small cafe, a man brushed past her, his face hidden by his hat. She barely noticed him until he murmured, "You never stopped chasing ghosts, Elizabeth." She turned. He was already gone. Chapter 1. A Whisper in the Parisian Breeze. The chill of the late October air nipped at Elizabeth Garrison's cheeks, a familiar sting that reminded her, paradoxically, of both home and the battlefields she'd left behind. Paris, even in the pale, watery sunlight of 1919, still held the breath of war, a faint scent of smoke and disinfectant clinging to the cobblestones. The laughter of children playing near the Tuileries garden seemed to bounce off the somber, gray buildings, a fragile counterpoint to the city's enduring sorrow. Elizabeth pulled her wool coat tighter, the worn fabric a comfort against the persistent dampness. It was the same coat she'd worn through countless hospital shifts, the faint, almost imperceptible stain on the left sleeve a ghostly reminder of a young soldier's blood, a life she couldn't save. She'd come to Paris seeking solace, or perhaps oblivion. The armistice had been signed almost a year ago, but the echoes of gunfire still reverberated in her dreams. The faces of the wounded, the dying, the lost, they crowded her waking hours, a relentless parade of grief. London had become unbearable, a constant reminder of Nathaniel, of the promises whispered in the brief, stolen moments before he'd shipped out to Flanders. His letters, filled with a desperate, almost frantic love, had stopped arriving 3 months before the war ended. The official telegram had been brutally concise: Major Nathaniel Blackwood, killed in action. Presumed the rest of the words had blurred into a meaningless jumble. Presumed dead. The uncertainty was a torment, a festering wound that refused to heal. She'd hoped Paris, a city she'd never visited before, might offer a distraction, a blank canvas onto which she could try, and fail, to paint a new life. She'd taken a small, sparsely furnished room near the Luxembourg Gardens, its single window offering a view of a courtyard where a lone, gnarled tree stubbornly clung to life. Days were spent wandering, aimlessly at first, then with a growing, almost desperate need to absorb the city, to lose herself in its labyrinthine streets and its resilient spirit. Evenings were spent reading or staring out the window, the silence broken only by the occasional mournful chime of a distant church bell. Today, she'd ventured further afield, drawn by the promise of a patisserie she'd heard whispered about amongst the other expatriate women she occasionally encountered at the small English-language bookstore near the Seine. The aroma of warm bread and sugar, a fleeting, almost painful reminder of happier times, had pulled her in. She'd ordered a café au lait and a small, almond croissant, choosing a table near the window, where she could watch the world go by. The café was bustling, a mix of locals and foreigners, their conversations a low, comforting hum. A young couple, their faces flushed with laughter, shared a pastry, their fingers intertwined. Elizabeth looked away, a sharp pang of longing twisting in her chest. She focused instead on the steam rising from her coffee, the delicate pattern of the china cup, the way the light caught the silver sugar tongs. Small details, anchors in a sea of uncertainty. A man brushed past her, his shoulder lightly grazing hers. He was tall, his form obscured by a broad-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes, and a heavy, military-style greatcoat. He murmured an apology, his voice a low rumble, barely audible above the cafe's din. It was a voice she knew, a voice that had haunted her dreams, a voice that should have been silenced forever in the mud of Flanders. "You never stopped chasing ghosts, Elizabeth." The words were barely a whisper, a breath of sound against the clatter of cups and the murmur of conversations. But they struck her with the force of a physical blow. She froze, her hand trembling as she raised it to her mouth, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The coffee cup rattled in its saucer, a tiny, discordant note in the symphony of the café. She turned, her gaze sweeping the room, searching for the source of that voice, that impossible voice. The man was already gone, swallowed by the crowd, leaving only the lingering scent of pipe tobacco and something else, something indefinably familiar, the scent of rain-soaked earth and gunpowder. Her breath caught in her throat.
It couldn't be. It couldn't be.
Nathaniel was dead. She'd seen the telegram, the cold, official words that had ripped her world apart. She'd mourned him, grieved for him, tried to bury him deep within the recesses of her heart, a love lost, a future shattered. But the voice that voiced it echoed in her mind, a phantom limb of a love she thought she'd amputated. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the tiled floor, drawing startled glances from the nearby patrons. She scanned the street outside, the crowds hurrying past, their faces blurred, indistinct. He was nowhere to be seen. Had she imagined it? Was it simply the product of a grief-stricken mind, conjuring a phantom from the depths of her despair? She pressed her hand against her chest, feeling the frantic beat of her heart, the tremor that ran through her body. Doubt, a cold, insidious serpent, began to coil around her hope. But deep down, beneath the layers of grief and disbelief, a tiny spark flickered. A spark of something she hadn't felt in months, something akin to hope. A foolish, irrational, impossible hope. But hope nonetheless. She had to know. She had to find him, even if it meant chasing a ghost. The croissant lay forgotten on her plate, its sweet, buttery scent now tainted with the bitter taste of uncertainty. Chapter 2. The Ghosts of Place Vendôme. The elegant facades of Place Vendôme, normally a beacon of Parisian sophistication, seemed to mock Elizabeth's frantic search. The rhythmic clip-clop of horses' hooves on the cobblestones, the gentle murmur of conversations from the upscale cafes, the glittering displays in the windows of jewelers, all of it felt surreal, a backdrop to a nightmare she couldn't escape. She'd rushed out of the cafe, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, her eyes scanning the faces of every passerby, searching for a glimpse of the man in the greatcoat, the man with the voice that haunted her dreams. He was gone, vanished as if he were a figment of her imagination, a cruel trick of the light and the lingering trauma of the war. But the scent of pipe tobacco and gunpowder, that was real. She'd smelled it 1,000 times on Nathaniel's clothes, a scent that was inextricably linked to him, to the stolen moments they'd shared before he'd left for the front. She walked, almost running at times, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She circled the square, her gaze darting from face to face, her hope dwindling with each passing moment. The faces were all strangers, their eyes filled with their own concerns, their own private sorrows. None of them held the spark of recognition she desperately sought. She paused, leaning against a cold, stone pillar, trying to catch her breath, trying to regain some semblance of composure. Her mind raced, replaying the brief encounter in the cafe, dissecting every detail, every nuance. His voice, it was undeniably Nathaniel's, though deeper, roughened by time and something else. Something she couldn't quite define. Pain? Regret? And the words, "You never stopped chasing ghosts, Elizabeth." It was a phrase he'd used before, a gentle teasing remark he'd made when she'd recounted a recurring dream she'd had, a dream of walking through a field of poppies, searching for him amongst the endless rows of white crosses. It was a phrase that only Nathaniel would know. She closed her eyes, trying to conjure his face, to remember the exact shade of his blue eyes, the way his lips curved into a smile, the small scar above his left eyebrow, a memento of a childhood fall from a tree. But the image was blurred, fragmented, like a shattered mirror reflecting a distorted reality. Grief had dulled the edges of her memory, blurring the sharp lines of his features, making him seem almost unreal. She opened her eyes, her gaze drawn to the Hotel Ritz, its opulent entrance a stark contrast to the muddy trenches she'd seen in France. Nathaniel had spoken of the Ritz, had promised to take her there after the war, to dance with her in the grand ballroom, to celebrate their future together. A future that had been brutally snatched away. A sudden thought struck her. If he was alive, if he was in Paris, where would he go? He wouldn't stay at the Ritz, not in his current state, whatever that might be. He was a soldier, a man of action, not a man of leisure. He'd be more comfortable in the shadows, in the less conspicuous corners of the city. She remembered a small, unassuming hotel near the Gare du Nord, a place he'd mentioned in one of his letters, a place where officers sometimes stayed when passing through Paris. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only lead she had. She hailed a taxi, her voice trembling as she gave the driver the address. The ride was a blur, a chaotic jumble of sights and sounds that barely registered. Her mind was consumed by a single, overwhelming question. What if it was him? And if it was, why had he disappeared? Why hadn't he contacted her? The questions swirled around her, a vortex of doubt and fear, threatening to pull her under. She clung to the tiny spark of hope, the fragile belief that he might still be alive, that their story wasn't over, that the telegram had been a mistake, a cruel twist of fate. As the taxi pulled up in front of the Hotel Saint-Jacques, a modest, 3-story building with faded shutters and a wrought iron balcony, Elizabeth felt a wave of nausea wash over her. This was it. The moment of truth. She paid the driver, her hand shaking so badly she could barely count the francs. She stood on the pavement, staring at the hotel entrance, her heart pounding in her chest. It was a daunting prospect, walking into that unknown space, confronting the possibility that she might be wrong, that she might be chasing a phantom, a figment of her grief-stricken imagination. But she couldn't turn back. She had to know. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever lay ahead, and pushed open the heavy, wooden door. The lobby was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of stale cigarette smoke and old furniture. A lone clerk, his face lined with weariness, looked up from behind the reception desk, his eyes questioning. Elizabeth took another deep breath and approached. Her voice was much steadier than her racing heart. Chapter 3. Letters never sent, words never spoken. I'm looking for someone, Elizabeth began, her voice a little shaky despite her effort to sound calm. A gentleman. He might have checked in recently. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a military bearing. She hesitated, unsure how much to reveal, how much to trust this stranger. He may be using a different name. The clerk, a man of indeterminate age with thinning hair and a perpetually tired expression, regarded her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. He'd seen his share of lost souls in the aftermath of the war, women searching for missing husbands, fathers, brothers. He'd learned to be wary, to offer little hope, to avoid the messy entanglements of other people's grief. We have many gentlemen staying here, madam, he said, his voice flat, devoid of inflection. Many who have seen things. Many who prefer to be anonymous. Elizabeth felt a flicker of frustration, but she forced herself to remain patient. She pulled a small, worn photograph from her purse, a picture of Nathaniel taken before the war, his face young, unlined, his eyes full of life and laughter. It was a painful reminder of what she had lost, of what might have been. He looks like this, she said, her voice trembling as she held out the photograph. But older, perhaps, with scars. The clerk took the photograph, his gaze flicking from the image to Elizabeth's face. He studied the picture for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Elizabeth held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. The silence stretched, taut and unbearable. Finally, he sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of the world's sorrows. There was a man he checked in 2 days ago. He fits your description. But he hesitated, his eyes meeting hers, a flicker of something akin to pity in their depths. He registered under the name of Mr. Smith. A common name, I know. He kept to himself. Paid in cash. Asked for a room on the top floor, at the back of the building. Elizabeth's heart leaped with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Mr. Smith. It was a ridiculously obvious alias, a name that screamed anonymity. It could be anyone. But the description, the top floor, at the back it sounded like Nathaniel. He always preferred quiet, out-of-the-way places. May I see him? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. The clerk hesitated again. He left strict instructions not to be disturbed. Said he was unwell. Elizabeth felt a surge of frustration. Please, she said, her voice pleading. It's a matter of life and death. I believe he may be someone I know. Someone I thought was lost. The clerk studied her face, searching for any sign of deception, any hint of ulterior motive. He saw only desperation, a raw, unfiltered grief that mirrored the countless other sorrows he'd witnessed in the wake of the war. He sighed again, a weary resignation in his voice. "Wait here," he said, disappearing into a back room. Elizabeth waited, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her body trembling with anticipation. The minutes stretched into an eternity, each tick of the grandfather clock in the corner of the lobby a hammer blow against her fragile hope. Finally, the clerk returned, a small, leather-bound book in his hand. He opened it, flipping through the pages, his finger tracing the lines of handwritten entries. He stopped, his gaze fixed on a particular entry. "Room 307, he said, his voice low. "But I warn you, madam, he may not be the man you remember. The war, it changes people." Elizabeth nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She took the stairs 2 at a time, her heart pounding in her chest. The 3rd floor was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of dust and decay. The hallway was narrow, the wallpaper peeling in places, the silence broken only by the creaking of the floorboards beneath her feet. She reached room 307, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She hesitated, her mind racing, her emotions a chaotic jumble of hope, fear, and disbelief. What if she was wrong? What if it wasn't him? And if it was him, what would she say? How could she explain the years of silence, the unanswered letters, the crushing weight of grief she'd carried? She took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever lay ahead. She knocked, her knuckles rapping softly against the wooden door. The silence that followed was deafening. She knocked again, louder this time. "Go away," a voice rasped from inside, a voice that was both familiar and foreign, a voice that sent a shiver down her spine. "Nathaniel?" she said, her voice trembling. It's Elizabeth." There was a long silence, broken only by the sound of her own ragged breathing. Then, the sound of footsteps, slow and heavy, approaching the door. The lock clicked, and the door opened a crack, revealing a sliver of a face that was both familiar and shockingly changed. An eye, the blue dulled with pain, stared back. Chapter 4. Beneath the Scars of War. The eye, once a vibrant, sparkling blue, was now clouded with a weariness that went beyond mere physical fatigue. It was the eye of a man who had seen too much, who had endured horrors that Elizabeth could only imagine. A network of fine lines, etched by time and hardship, radiated from the corner, a stark contrast to the smooth, youthful skin she remembered. Below the eye, a jagged scar, a pale, angry line against the weathered skin, bisected his cheek, a permanent reminder of the violence he had witnessed, or perhaps endured. The door opened further, revealing more of his face, more of the devastation that the war had wrought. His hair, once a thick, unruly mop of dark brown curls, was now streaked with gray, cut short in a severe, military style. His jaw, once strong and defined, was now gaunt, hollowed, accentuating the sharp angles of his cheekbones. He was thinner, his frame almost skeletal, his clothes hanging loosely on his body. But it was him. Despite the changes, despite the ravages of time and war, it was undeniably Nathaniel. The shape of his nose, the curve of his lips, the slight cleft in his chin, those were details that even the most brutal battles couldn't erase. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper, barely audible. He sounded surprised, but not entirely, as if he'd been expecting her, yet dreading her arrival. She stepped into the room, her gaze sweeping the small, sparsely furnished space. A single bed, a rickety chair, a small table littered with papers and empty bottles. It was a stark, almost monastic existence, a far cry from the comfortable life he'd once known. "Nathaniel," she repeated, her voice choked with emotion. She reached out to him, her hand trembling, wanting to touch him, to reassure herself that he was real, that he wasn't a phantom conjured by her grief. He flinched, recoiling from her touch as if burned. "Don't," he said, his voice sharp, his eyes filled with a pain that went beyond the physical. "Don't touch me." Elizabeth froze, her hand hovering in the air, her heart aching at his rejection.
Why?
She asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why are you here? Why didn't you come home?" He turned away from her, his back to the room, his shoulders slumped with a weariness that seemed to penetrate his very bones. He walked to the window, staring out at the bleak, gray cityscape, his silhouette framed against the pale light. "I couldn't," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. I was a coward." Elizabeth felt a surge of disbelief. Nathaniel, a coward? It was unthinkable. He was the bravest man she'd ever known. He'd faced down enemy fire. He'd led his men through hellish battles. He'd earned medals for his valor. Cowardice was not a word she would ever associate with him. "That's not true," she said, her voice firm. "You were a hero. I read the reports. I saw the citations." He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "Hero?" he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Is that what they told you? That I was a hero? They lied, Elizabeth. They all lied." He turned back to face her, his eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and despair. "I made a mistake. A terrible mistake.
I betrayed my men."
I betrayed my country. I betrayed you." Elizabeth felt a wave of confusion wash over her.
"What are you talking about?"
she asked, her voice trembling. "What mistake? What betrayal?" He hesitated, his gaze searching her face, as if trying to decide whether to trust her, whether to reveal the secrets that had been eating away at him for so long. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, his jaw clenched tight. It's a long story," he said, his voice weary. "A story you wouldn't want to hear." "I want to hear it," she said, her voice insistent. "I deserve to hear it. I've spent the last year believing you were dead. I've mourned you, grieved for you, tried to move on. I deserve to know the truth, Nathaniel, whatever it is." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a sadness that was almost unbearable. He saw the pain in her eyes, the unwavering love that still shone through, despite everything. He knew he couldn't keep the truth from her any longer. He owed her that much. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the ordeal ahead. "It happened at Passchendaele," he began, his voice low, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the walls of the room, the horrors of the past unfolding. Chapter 5. The uninvited guest at the widow's gathering. Elizabeth settled into the rickety chair, the only other piece of furniture in the room besides the bed. She watched Nathaniel, his profile etched against the fading light of the window, his body tense, his hands clenched into fists. The air in the room was thick with unspoken words, with the weight of his untold story. Passchendaele. The name itself was a synonym for horror, a byword for the senseless slaughter of the war. She'd seen the wounded from that battle, the men with shattered bodies and haunted eyes. She could only imagine the terrors Nathaniel had witnessed, the burdens he carried. He began to speak, his voice slow and halting at first, as if each word was a physical effort. He described the relentless shelling, the mud, the blood, the screams of the dying. He spoke of the constant fear, the gnawing hunger, the bone-chilling cold. He painted a picture of hell on earth, a landscape of unimaginable suffering. He spoke of his men, his voice filled with a mixture of pride and guilt. He described their courage, their loyalty, their unwavering devotion to duty. He spoke of their faces, their names, their stories, bringing them back to life for a brief, fleeting moment. Then his voice faltered. He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor, his hands clenching and unclenching. There was a mission," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "A reconnaissance patrol. We were supposed to gather intelligence on enemy positions." He paused, taking a deep, shuddering breath. "We were ambushed, outnumbered, outgunned. We fought bravely, but it was hopeless. We were being slaughtered." He looked up at Elizabeth, his eyes filled with a pain that was almost unbearable. I made a decision. A split-second decision, that changed everything. I ordered a retreat. I left some of my men behind. Men who were wounded, men who couldn't keep up. I abandoned them. Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. She knew the military code, the unwritten law of the battlefield. You never left a man behind. It was a sacred trust, a bond that was forged in the crucible of war. They were going to die anyway, he said, his voice defensive, his eyes pleading for understanding. It was a strategic withdrawal. I had to save the rest of my men. I had to get the information back to headquarters. But you left them, Elizabeth said, her voice soft, not accusatory, but simply stating a fact. He nodded, his head hanging low, his shoulders slumped with the weight of his guilt. I did. And they were captured, tortured,
Killed.
and the information, it was useless. It didn't change anything. The battle was lost anyway. He turned away from her, his back to the room, his voice barely a whisper. I'm a coward, Elizabeth. I broke the code. I betrayed my men. I deserve to be punished. Elizabeth stood up, walking over to him, placing a gentle hand on his arm. He flinched at her touch, but he didn't pull away. You were in an impossible situation, Nathaniel, she said, her voice soothing. You made a difficult decision, a decision that any commander might have made. You did what you thought was best. You saved the lives of the men who could still fight. He shook his head, his eyes filled with self-loathing. It wasn't enough. It will never be enough. I should have stayed. I should have died with them. She turned him to face her, her hands cupping his face, forcing him to look at her. Don't say that, she said, her voice firm.
You survived.
You have to live with that, Nathaniel. You have to find a way to forgive yourself. That evening, after leaving Nathaniel in his room, Elizabeth had been invited to a small gathering of expatriate women. Some of them were war widows. The invitation mentioned sharing of their experience. As Elizabeth was getting ready to leave the gathering, she overheard one of the women talking about a man recently spotted, rumored to be a deserter, branded a traitor, and marked. She had never met this woman, but overheard her say, "He goes by Mr. Smith." Elizabeth froze. Just as she was about to ask for more details, a woman approached, her eyes cold and hostile. You shouldn't be here. This gathering is for widows. Chapter 6. A Dance with Shadows and Secrets. The woman's words, sharp and laced with venom, hung in the air, a stark reminder of Elizabeth's ambiguous position. She wasn't a widow, not officially, yet she carried the grief of one. And now, this whispered rumor, this Mr. Smith branded a deserter, it cast a long, dark shadow over the fragile hope she'd found in Nathaniel's return. I understand, Elizabeth stammered, her cheeks burning with shame and a rising tide of fear. She gathered her coat, her hands trembling. I apologize. I was invited by a mutual acquaintance. It was a lie, a flimsy attempt to salvage some dignity, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. The woman, tall and imposing, with a severe hairstyle and a dress that spoke of mourning and money, simply stared at her, her eyes narrowed, her lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. Leave, she said, her voice cold and dismissive. And don't come back. Elizabeth fled, the whispers of the other women following her like stinging insects. She hurried through the dimly lit streets, the gaslights casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to mirror her own anxieties. The city, once a refuge, now felt menacing, full of hidden dangers and unspoken accusations. The encounter at the gathering had shaken her, not just because of the woman's hostility, but because of the chilling rumors she'd overheard. A deserter, a traitor, Mr. Smith, could it be Nathaniel? The thought was unbearable, yet she couldn't dismiss it. He had admitted to abandoning his men, to making a decision that had cost lives. Had that decision, however understandable in the chaos of battle, been interpreted as something more sinister? Had he been branded a deserter by the military authorities? She reached her small room, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She lit the gas lamp, the flickering flame casting dancing shadows on the walls, making the familiar space seem strange and unfamiliar. She paced the room, her thoughts a chaotic jumble of fear and confusion. She had to find out the truth. She had to know what Nathaniel was hiding, what he was running from. She couldn't rely on his fragmented, guilt-ridden account. She needed more information, more context. She remembered the woman at the gathering, the one who had mentioned the rumor. She hadn't caught her name, but she remembered her face, her distinctive brooch, a silver serpent coiled around a small, dark stone. She had to find her, to ask her about this Mr. Smith.
But how?
She knew so few people in Paris, and the expatriate community was a closed, tight-knit world, wary of outsiders. She thought of the bookstore near the Seine, the place where she'd first encountered some of the other English-speaking women. It was a long shot, but it was the only lead she had. The next morning, she returned to the bookstore, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and apprehension. She browsed the shelves, pretending to be interested in the books, her eyes scanning the faces of the other customers, searching for the woman with the serpent brooch. She spent hours in the store, her anxiety growing with each passing moment. She was about to give up, to concede defeat, when she saw her. The woman, her back to Elizabeth, was talking to the bookseller, her voice low and conspiratorial. Elizabeth recognized the brooch, glinting in the dim light of the store. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the confrontation. She approached the woman, her voice trembling slightly. "Excuse me," she said. "I couldn't help but overhear you yesterday at the gathering. You were talking about a man, a Mr. Smith." The woman turned, her eyes narrowing, her expression wary. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice guarded. "Please," Elizabeth said, her voice pleading. "It's important. I believe I know this man. I need to know what he's accused of." The woman hesitated, her gaze searching Elizabeth's face, as if trying to assess her sincerity. She saw the desperation in her eyes, the raw, unfiltered emotion that couldn't be faked. "It's just a rumor," she said, her voice softening slightly. "But they say he deserted his men, that he betrayed his country, that he's being hunted by the military police." She lowered her voice, glancing around the store to make sure no one else was listening. "They say he has a distinctive scar on his face." Elizabeth felt a cold hand grip her heart. The scar, Nathaniel's scar, it was undeniable. The rumor was about him. But what did it mean? Was he truly a deserter? Or was there more to the story than he had revealed? As the woman looked away, Elizabeth caught a name tag on her dress. Lady Beatrice Worthington. Elizabeth felt a hand on her shoulder. Chapter 7. The Price of Loyalty. The Cost of Truth. The hand on her shoulder was firm, yet not unkind. Elizabeth turned to see a middle-aged man, his face lined with concern, his eyes, a gentle, understanding blue. He wore a tweed jacket, slightly worn at the elbows, and a neatly trimmed mustache. He looked like a professor, or perhaps a clergyman, someone accustomed to offering comfort and guidance. "I couldn't help but overhear," he said, his voice low and soothing. "You seem distressed. Is there anything I can do to help?" Elizabeth hesitated, unsure whether to trust this stranger. But there was something in his eyes, a sincerity and a warmth, that reassured her. She glanced at Lady Beatrice, who was now pretending to browse the shelves, her back to them, clearly wanting to avoid any further involvement. It's complicated," Elizabeth said, her voice wavering. "I'm looking for someone. A man who may be in trouble." The man nodded, his expression understanding. "I understand," he said. "Paris is full of troubled souls these days. The war has left its mark on all of us." He paused, then added, "My name is Arthur Davies. I'm a friend to many in the expatriate community. Perhaps I know something that might help you." Elizabeth felt a flicker of hope. This man, Arthur Davies, seemed to be a well-connected, respected figure within the community. He might be able to provide the information she desperately needed. "His name is Mr. Smith," she said, her voice low, her eyes searching his face for any sign of recognition. He's a soldier. He has a scar on his face." Arthur Davies's expression didn't change, but his eyes seemed to darken slightly, a flicker of something akin to sadness passing through them. "I know of him," he said, his voice grave. Or rather, I know of the rumors. They are disturbing. Are they true? Elizabeth asked, her voice barely a whisper. Is he a deserter? Arthur Davies hesitated, his gaze shifting to the window, as if contemplating the weight of his words. The truth, my dear, is often a slippery thing, he said, especially in times of war. What one man calls desertion, another might call a necessary sacrifice. He turned back to Elizabeth, his eyes meeting hers. I know that this Mr. Smith was involved in a particularly brutal battle. Passchendaele, I believe. There were conflicting reports about his actions. Some say he showed extraordinary courage. Others whisper of cowardice and betrayal. He paused, then added, the military authorities, however, are not interested in nuanced interpretations. They are looking for someone to blame, someone to make an example of. And Mr. Smith seems to have become their scapegoat. Elizabeth felt a wave of despair wash over her. It was worse than she had feared. Nathaniel wasn't just hiding from his past, he was hiding from the law, from a military justice system that was often harsh and unforgiving.
But why?
She asked, her voice trembling. Why would they target him? He said he ordered a retreat to save his men. Surely that's not a crime? Arthur Davies sighed.
It's not that simple, he said.
There are other factors at play. Political considerations. Powerful enemies. Secrets that are best left buried. He lowered his voice, leaning closer to Elizabeth. I have heard whispers that Mr. Smith may have stumbled upon something he shouldn't have seen. Something that powerful people want to keep hidden. Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. This was getting more complicated, more dangerous by the minute. Nathaniel wasn't just a wounded soldier haunted by his past. He was a man caught in a web of intrigue, a pawn in a game he didn't understand. What kind of secrets? She asked, her voice barely audible. Arthur Davies hesitated, his gaze searching her face, as if assessing her trustworthiness. I cannot say for certain, he said, but it involves high-ranking officers, perhaps even government officials. There are rumors of corruption, of war profiteering, of treason. He paused, then added, Be careful, my dear. You are treading on dangerous ground. These are powerful people, and they will stop at nothing to protect their interests. If they find out you are helping Mr. Smith, they will not hesitate to silence you. His words, meant as a warning, only strengthened Elizabeth's resolve. She had to help Nathaniel, not just because she loved him, but because she believed in him. She couldn't stand by and watch him be destroyed by lies and conspiracies. She had to uncover the truth, whatever the cost. The weight of her decision settled. She would see him and talk. Chapter 8. Echoes of gunfire, whispers of betrayal. Elizabeth returned to the Hotel St. Jacques, her mind buzzing with Arthur Davies's warning. The city, once a refuge, now felt like a trap, every shadow concealing a potential threat, every stranger a possible enemy. She climbed the stairs to room 307, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. She had to see Nathaniel, to confront him with what she'd learned, to find out the truth, however painful it might be. She knocked on the door, her knuckles rapping softly against the wood. There was no answer. She knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. A sense of unease began to creep over her. Had he left? Had he been discovered? She tried the doorknob, her hand trembling. To her surprise, it turned. The door was unlocked. She pushed it open slowly, her eyes scanning the dimly lit room. The room was empty. The bed was unmade, the few belongings he had scattered on the table. There was no sign of Nathaniel. But there was something else. A small, crumpled piece of paper lying on the floor, near the window. She picked it up, her fingers trembling as she unfolded it. It was a note, written in Nathaniel's familiar, if now somewhat shaky, handwriting. The words were brief, cryptic, and chilling. They know. I have to go. Don't follow me. It's too dangerous. Forget me, Elizabeth. Forget you ever knew me. The note slipped from her fingers, fluttering to the floor like a fallen leaf. She felt a wave of despair wash over her, a sense of loss so profound it threatened to overwhelm her. He was gone. He'd slipped away again, disappearing into the shadows, leaving her alone with her fears and her unanswered questions. But she couldn't give up. She wouldn't give up. She had to find him, to understand why he was running, why he was so afraid. She reread the note, searching for any clue, any hint of where he might have gone.
They know. Who were they?
The military police? The powerful enemies Arthur Davies had mentioned? Or someone else entirely?
Don't follow me.
It was a plea, a warning, but also a challenge. He didn't want her to get involved, to put herself in danger. But she couldn't stand by and do nothing. She had to follow him, to help him, even if it meant risking her own life. Forget me, Elizabeth. That was the most painful part of the note, the final, crushing blow. He was asking her to erase him from her memory, to pretend he had never existed. It was an impossible request, a demand she could never fulfill. She looked around the room, searching for any other clue, any indication of where he might have gone. Her gaze fell on the small table, littered with his belongings. There were a few books, a pipe, a half-empty bottle of brandy, and a map. It was a map of France, a detailed military map, the kind used by officers during the war. It was old, faded, and marked with various symbols and notations. She spread it out on the table, her eyes scanning the intricate details. There was a circle drawn in red ink around a small village in the north of France, near the Belgian border. The village was called Bois-le-Duc. She recognized the name. It was near Passchendaele, the site of the battle where Nathaniel had made his decision. Was that where he was going? Back to the place where his nightmare had begun? Back to the scene of his alleged crime? It seemed illogical, suicidal even. But perhaps he was going there to clear his name, to confront his accusers, to find the evidence that would prove his innocence. She heard a noise that was reminiscent of distant gunfire. She looked at the window. The sound was not from outside. It was the floorboards. Someone was on the stairs, and they were not being subtle. Elizabeth grabbed the map and Nathaniel's note, stuffing both into her coat pocket, and blew out the candle. The room was immediately dark. Chapter 9. Between Duty and Desire. The heavy footsteps grew closer, echoing in the narrow hallway. Elizabeth held her breath, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She pressed herself against the wall, behind the door, hoping to remain unseen in the darkness. The door to room 307 creaked open, a sliver of light from the hallway illuminating the room. A figure silhouetted in the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered, his face obscured by the shadows. He held something in his hand, a glint of metal reflecting the faint light. A gun. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't Nathaniel. This man was a stranger, an intruder, a threat. She had to escape, to get away, but she was trapped. The window was too high, the hallway blocked by the armed figure. The man stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the darkness, his movements slow and deliberate. He was searching for something or someone. He moved towards the table, his back to Elizabeth, his attention focused on the scattered belongings. It was her only chance. She had to act quickly before he turned around, before he discovered her hiding place. She took a deep breath, summoning all her courage, all her strength. She lunged forward, slamming the door against the man's back, pushing him off balance. He stumbled, cursing, his gun clattering to the floor. Elizabeth didn't hesitate. She ran, pushing past him, out into the hallway, down the stairs, towards the lobby. He recovered quickly, his heavy footsteps pounding behind her, his shouts echoing through the hotel. Stop. Stop her. She reached the lobby, the startled clerk looking up from behind the desk, his eyes wide with alarm. She didn't stop. She pushed past him, out into the street, into the chaotic, crowded streets of Paris. She ran, blindly, desperately, her lungs burning, her legs aching. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she had to get away, to escape the man with a gun, to disappear into the anonymity of the city. She glanced behind her, saw him emerging from the hotel, his eyes scanning the street, searching for her. He was still far away, but he was gaining on her. She had to find a hiding place, a place where he wouldn't find her. She ducked into a narrow alleyway, a dark, foul-smelling passage between two buildings. She pressed herself against the wall, her body trembling, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She waited, listening, her heart pounding in her chest. She heard his footsteps, closer now, echoing in the alleyway. He was coming closer, closer. She closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable. Then silence. The footsteps stopped. She held her breath, listening. Had he given up? Had he gone the wrong way? She waited, her body tense, her senses on high alert. A hand grabbed her arm, a strong, firm grip that sent a jolt of fear through her body. She gasped, her eyes flying open. It was Nathaniel. He pulled her closer, his face close to hers, his eyes filled with a mixture of urgency and relief. "Elizabeth," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "What are you doing here? I told you not to follow me." She stared at him, her mind reeling, her emotions a chaotic jumble of fear, relief, and confusion. He was in your room," she stammered. "A man with a gun. He was looking for you." Nathaniel's expression darkened, his jaw clenching tight.
"I know," he said.
"I saw him. I was watching from across the street. I had to make sure you were safe." He pulled her deeper into the alleyway, away from the street, into the shadows. "We have to go," he said.
"Now."
"They'll be looking for us." "But where?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Where can we go?" He looked at her, his eyes filled with a conflict between what he felt he had to do and the undeniable tug of his heart towards her. His voice was thick with emotion, and his next words were not directed to her. "They have pushed too far." Chapter 10. The Serpent in the Garden of Reconciliation. Nathaniel led her through a labyrinth of back alleys and narrow streets, a hidden world beneath the bustling surface of Paris. He moved with a practiced ease, a familiarity that suggested he'd spent time in these shadows, evading pursuit, hiding from his pursuers. Elizabeth struggled to keep up, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her legs aching from the relentless pace. They finally reached a small, nondescript building, tucked away in a quiet side street near the Canal Saint-Martin. It looked like an abandoned warehouse, its windows boarded up, its walls covered in graffiti. Nathaniel produced a key, unlocking a heavy, metal door, and ushered her inside. The interior was dark and cavernous, the air thick with the smell of dust and damp concrete. Moonlight filtered through cracks in the boarded-up windows, casting eerie shadows on the walls. There were piles of crates and barrels scattered around, remnants of the building's former life. It was a desolate, unwelcoming place, but it offered a temporary refuge, a place to hide from the dangers that lurked outside. "Where are we?" Elizabeth asked, her voice echoing in the vast space. "A safe house," Nathaniel said, his voice low. "Or at least it used to be. It belongs to a friend. Someone who owes me a favor." He lit a small, oil lamp, the flickering flame casting a warm, golden glow on his face, illuminating the lines of worry and fatigue etched around his eyes. He looked exhausted, his shoulders slumped with a weariness that went beyond the physical. "Who was that man?" Elizabeth asked, her voice trembling. "The one in your room with the gun?" Nathaniel hesitated, his gaze avoiding hers.
"I don't know," he said.
"But I have a feeling he was sent by the same people who are hunting me." "The military police?" Elizabeth asked. Nathaniel shook his head.
"No."
"Something bigger. Something more powerful." He walked over to a pile of crates, pulling one aside to reveal a hidden compartment. He reached inside, pulling out a small, leather-bound box. He opened it, revealing a collection of documents, letters, and photographs. "This is what they're after," he said, his voice low. "This is what they're trying to keep hidden." Elizabeth looked at the documents, her eyes scanning the faded handwriting, the official seals, the blurred images. She didn't understand what they meant, what secrets they held, but she knew they were important, dangerous even. "What is it?" she asked, her voice hushed. Nathaniel hesitated, his gaze searching her face, as if trying to decide whether to trust her, whether to reveal the full extent of his burden. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the ordeal ahead. "It's evidence," he said. "Evidence of corruption, of war profiteering, of treason. It implicates high-ranking officers, government officials, even members of the aristocracy. He paused, then added, it all goes back to Passchendaele. To that decision I made. The retreat, it wasn't just a military blunder. It was a cover-up. A way to silence the men who knew the truth. Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. This was bigger, more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Nathaniel wasn't just a victim of circumstance, he was a witness to a conspiracy, a man who possessed information that could bring down powerful people. They were using the war, she said, her voice filled with disbelief. Using it to enrich themselves, to further their own ambitions. Nathaniel nodded, his eyes filled with a bitter anger. They were sending men to their deaths for profit. They were sacrificing lives for their own greed. He looked at Elizabeth, his eyes pleading for understanding. I couldn't let them get away with it, he said. I had to expose them, to bring them to justice. But how? Elizabeth asked. How can you fight them? They're too powerful. They'll destroy you. Nathaniel smiled, a grim, determined smile that sent a shiver down her spine. I have a plan, he said. A way to turn the tables on them. To use their own secrets against them. He reached into the box, pulling out a small, silver locket. It was intricately carved, with a delicate floral design. He opened it, revealing a miniature portrait of a woman, a beautiful woman with dark hair and piercing eyes. This, he said, his voice low, is the key. This woman, she knows everything. She was involved with one of the conspirators. She has evidence that can prove their guilt.
Who is she?
Elizabeth asked. Nathaniel hesitated. Her name is Serafina Dubois. She's a singer, a performer. She works at a club in Montmartre. He looked away, embarrassed. Elizabeth noticed a familiar brooch on the small portrait, a coiled serpent. Chapter 11. A stolen moment, a shattered promise. Montmartre. The name conjured images of artists, bohemians, and a vibrant, if somewhat seedy, nightlife. It was a world away from the quiet, respectable circles Elizabeth usually moved in, a place of hidden dangers and unspoken desires. And this Serafina Dubois, the singer with the serpent brooch, the woman who held the key to Nathaniel's salvation, she was a mystery, an enigma, a figure who both intrigued and frightened Elizabeth. We have to find her, Elizabeth said, her voice firm, her resolve hardening. We have to get that evidence. Nathaniel looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and apprehension. It's too dangerous, Elizabeth, he said. I can't let you get involved. This is my fight, not yours. It's our fight, Nathaniel, she said, her voice insistent. I'm not going to abandon you. Not now, not ever. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek, his fingers tracing the curve of her jaw. His touch was electric, sending a shiver down her spine, awakening a longing that she had tried to bury, to suppress. You're a stubborn woman, Elizabeth Garrison, he said, his voice soft, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. And you're a foolish man, Nathaniel Blackwood, she replied, her voice equally soft, her eyes meeting his. But I wouldn't have you any other way. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. They were alone in the darkness, surrounded by the ghosts of the past, the dangers of the present, but all that mattered was the connection between them, the unspoken love that had survived the war, the separation, the years of silence. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a tentative, hesitant kiss that quickly deepened, becoming more passionate, more desperate. It was a kiss that spoke of longing, of regret, of a love that had been denied, a future that had been stolen. Elizabeth responded with equal fervor, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body pressing against his. She had waited so long for this, for him, for the feeling of his arms around her, his lips on hers. It was a moment of stolen bliss, a brief respite from the storm that raged around them. But the moment couldn't last. The reality of their situation, the dangers they faced, intruded, shattering the fragile illusion of peace. Nathaniel pulled away, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and determination. We can't, he said, his voice hoarse.
Not now.
Not until this is over. Elizabeth nodded, her heart aching, but her resolve unshaken. She understood. They had a mission, a purpose, a fight to win. Their personal desires, their long-held dreams, had to wait. We'll go to Montmartre, she said. We'll find Serafina Dubois. And we'll get that evidence. Nathaniel nodded. But we have to be careful. We don't know who we can trust. We have to assume that everyone is a potential enemy. He looked at the locket, at the portrait of Serafina Dubois, his expression grim.
She's our only hope, he said.
But she's also a risk. She may not be willing to help us. She may even betray us. They left the safe house under the cover of darkness, blending into the shadows, becoming invisible in the labyrinthine streets of Paris. They took a circuitous route, avoiding the main thoroughfares, sticking to the back alleys and the less traveled paths. As they walked, Elizabeth couldn't help but think about Serafina Dubois. The woman with the serpent brooch, the same brooch she'd seen on Lady Beatrice Worthington. A connection? A coincidence? Or something more sinister? The image of the serpent, a symbol of temptation, of betrayal, of hidden danger, seemed to follow them, a constant reminder of the precariousness of their situation. They were walking into a trap, a web of deceit and intrigue, and they had no idea who was pulling the strings. They reached Montmartre as dawn was breaking, the sky a pale, washed-out gray. The streets were still relatively quiet, the revelers of the night having long since retreated to their beds. The air was thick with the scent of stale cigarettes and cheap perfume, a lingering reminder of the previous night's debauchery. The silence would not last. As they headed towards the club, they could hear the faint, haunting melody of a piano drifting from a nearby building. A promise of the performance ahead. Chapter 12. The unraveling of a carefully constructed lie. The club, Le Chat Noir, was a dimly lit, smoky establishment, its walls adorned with faded posters of past performers, its air thick with the scent of stale beer and cheap perfume. It was a far cry from the elegant salons and grand ballrooms Elizabeth was accustomed to, a place where secrets were whispered, deals were made, and lives were often ruined. Nathaniel, his hat pulled low over his eyes, his collar turned up, blended seamlessly into the shadows, his military bearing somehow adapting to the atmosphere of clandestine meetings and hushed conversations. Elizabeth, however, felt out of place, her simple dress and lack of ostentatious jewelry making her stand out amongst the more flamboyant clientele. They found a table in a dark corner, away from the prying eyes of the other patrons. Nathaniel ordered 2 glasses of absinthe, the potent, green liquid a common drink in these establishments, a way to numb the senses and loosen the tongues. "How are we going to find her?" Elizabeth asked, her voice low, her eyes scanning the room, searching for a woman who matched the portrait in the locket. "We wait," Nathaniel said. "She'll be here. She performs every night. She's the star attraction." He took a sip of his absinthe, his gaze fixed on the small, empty stage at the far end of the room. He seemed nervous, agitated, his leg bouncing restlessly beneath the table. "You know her, don't you?" Elizabeth asked, her voice soft, her eyes searching his face. Nathaniel hesitated, his gaze avoiding hers. "I've met her," he said, his voice evasive. "A few times. During the war. She entertained the troops. She was popular." Elizabeth sensed there was more to the story, a hidden connection between Nathaniel and Serafina that he wasn't revealing. She remembered the way he'd looked at the locket, the way his voice had softened when he'd spoken her name. Was it just admiration? Or something more? "She was your lover," Elizabeth said, the word a statement, not a question. Nathaniel flinched, his eyes finally meeting hers, his expression a mixture of guilt and regret. "It was a long time ago," he said. Before I met you.
It was a wartime romance.
Brief, fleeting, meaningless." Elizabeth felt a pang of jealousy, a sharp, unexpected pain that surprised her. She had no claim on Nathaniel's past, she knew that, but the thought of him with another woman, especially a woman like Serafina Dubois, filled her with a sense of unease. "Does she know about the evidence?" Elizabeth asked, her voice tight. Nathaniel nodded. She knows something, he said. But I don't know how much. She's careful. She doesn't trust easily. The lights dimmed, a hush falling over the room. A lone spotlight illuminated the stage, revealing a grand piano, its keys gleaming in the soft light. A man, dressed in a tuxedo, his hair slicked back, took his place at the piano, his fingers striking a dramatic chord. Then she appeared. Serafina Dubois. She was even more beautiful than her portrait, her dark hair cascading down her back, her eyes sparkling like diamonds, her lips painted a deep, seductive red. She wore a shimmering, emerald green gown that clung to her curves, revealing a generous amount of cleavage. The serpent brooch, the same one Elizabeth had seen on Lady Beatrice, was pinned to her dress, glinting in the spotlight. She began to sing, her voice a powerful, sultry contralto that filled the room, captivating the audience, drawing them into her world of passion and intrigue. She sang of love, of loss, of betrayal, of secrets, her voice laced with a raw emotion that seemed to hint at a hidden pain, a hidden truth. Elizabeth watched her, mesmerized, her initial jealousy giving way to a grudging admiration. This woman was a force of nature, a survivor, a woman who had learned to use her beauty and her talent to navigate a dangerous world. As Serafina sang, Elizabeth noticed a man watching her from a table near the stage. He was well-dressed, expensively so, with a cruel, handsome face and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He had an air of authority, of power, that made Elizabeth uneasy. And on his lapel, almost hidden, was a small, almost imperceptible pin. Its design was of 2 crossed swords. Nathaniel noticed him too. He leaned in, his voice barely a whisper, military intelligence. He looked, pale, back at Serafina, continuing to sing. As the song progressed, the lyrics changed, subtle but pointed and direct. Lyrics about a soldier who made an impossible choice. About the price of an oath. Elizabeth then realized Serafina was singing Nathaniel's story, and she knew more than he thought. The applause, at the end of the song, was deafening. Except from one corner. Chapter 13. Across the fields of Flanders, a memory remains. The silence from the corner table, where the man from military intelligence sat, was more telling than any applause. It was a silence of disapproval, of threat, a clear indication that Serafina's song, her thinly veiled portrayal of Nathaniel's story, had not gone unnoticed. Nathaniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hand instinctively reaching for the inside of his coat, where he kept the documents, the evidence that could either exonerate him or condemn him. He knew he was walking a tightrope, balancing between exposure and oblivion, and Serafina's performance had just made the rope a lot thinner. "She knows," Elizabeth whispered, her eyes fixed on Serafina, who was now acknowledging the applause with a graceful bow, her expression unreadable. "She knows everything." "Yes," Nathaniel said, his voice grim. "But the question is, whose side is she on?" As Serafina left the stage, the lights came up, and the buzz of conversation resumed. The man from military intelligence stood up, his gaze sweeping the room, his eyes lingering for a moment on Nathaniel and Elizabeth before he made his way towards the exit. "We need to talk to her," Elizabeth said.
Now.
"Before he gets to her first." Nathaniel nodded, his expression determined. "I'll go backstage," he said. "You stay here. If anything happens, if he comes back, get out of here."
Don't wait for me.
Elizabeth wanted to protest, to insist on going with him, but she knew he was right. It was too dangerous. She had to be the escape plan, the backup, the one who could get away and tell the story if things went wrong. She watched as Nathaniel made his way towards the back of the club, disappearing through a door marked private. She felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach, a sense of foreboding that she couldn't shake. She waited, her eyes glued to the door, her ears straining to hear any sound from beyond. The minutes stretched into an eternity, each tick of the clock a hammer blow against her fragile hope. She saw the man from military intelligence return, his expression even more grim than before. He scanned the room, his eyes searching, his hand resting on the inside of his coat, where she knew he kept his gun. He was looking for Nathaniel. Elizabeth ducked her head, pretending to be engrossed in her drink, trying to make herself invisible. He walked past her table, his gaze sweeping the room, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. He headed towards the back of the club, towards the same door Nathaniel had disappeared through. Elizabeth's heart pounded in her chest. She had to do something to warn Nathaniel, to distract the man, to buy him some time. She stood up, her legs trembling, her mind racing. She had to create a diversion, a distraction, something that would draw the man's attention away from the backstage area. She walked towards the stage, her steps faltering at first, then gaining confidence. She reached the piano, the instrument still warm from Serafina's performance. She sat down, her fingers hovering over the keys. She hadn't played in years, not since before the war, before Nathaniel had left, before her world had been shattered. But the muscle memory was still there, the ingrained knowledge of chords and melodies, the ability to create music, to express emotions through sound. She began to play, a simple, haunting melody, a song she and Nathaniel had both loved, a song that spoke of love and loss, of hope and despair. It was a song that had been popular during the war, a song that had resonated with soldiers and civilians alike, a song that evoked memories of home, of loved ones lost, of a world that had been forever changed. Keep the home fires burning. The room fell silent, the conversation stopping, the clinking of glasses ceasing. All eyes were on her, on the woman at the piano, the woman who was playing a song that touched the deepest chords of their hearts. The man from military intelligence stopped, his hand still on his coat, his eyes fixed on Elizabeth. He was intrigued, drawn in by the music, by the raw emotion in her playing. He hesitated, his mission momentarily forgotten, his focus shifting from the hunt to the haunting melody that filled the room. Elizabeth played on, her fingers moving across the keys with increasing confidence, her voice joining the music, soft and clear, filling the silence with a bittersweet lament. She was playing for Nathaniel, for herself, for all the lost souls of the war, for a future that might never be. She looked down at her hands. This was a song about hope, but all she could feel was a growing dread. Chapter 14. The Weight of a Soldier's Oath. As Elizabeth played, her voice weaving a tapestry of sorrow and hope, she saw movement from the corner of her eye. Nathaniel emerged from the backstage door, his face pale, his expression grim. He was followed by Serafina, her arm linked with his, her eyes darting around the room, assessing the situation. The man from military intelligence saw them too. His hand moved from his coat, no longer hesitant, but purposeful. He drew his gun, the metallic click echoing in the sudden silence that followed the end of Elizabeth's song. "Nathaniel Blackwood," he said, his voice loud and clear, cutting through the stunned silence. "You're under arrest. For desertion. For treason. For crimes against the crown." The room erupted in chaos. Patrons screamed, ducking for cover, overturning tables and chairs in their haste to escape. Serafina pulled Nathaniel towards a side exit, her movements quick and decisive.
"Go,"
she yelled. "Get out of here. I'll handle this." Nathaniel hesitated, his gaze torn between Elizabeth and Serafina, his loyalty divided between the woman he loved and the woman who held the key to his freedom. "Go with her, Nathaniel," Elizabeth shouted, her voice rising above the din. "I'll be fine. Just go." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and regret, a silent promise passing between them. He nodded, then turned and followed Serafina, disappearing through the side exit, into the darkness of the Parisian night. The man from military intelligence pushed his way through the crowd, his gun trained on the exit, his face contorted with rage. He fired a shot, the bullet shattering a window, sending shards of glass flying through the air. Elizabeth ducked, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to get out of here, to escape the chaos, to find Nathaniel, to help him. She crawled towards the main entrance, dodging the fleeing patrons, the overturned furniture, the broken glass. She reached the street, the cold night air hitting her face, a stark contrast to the smoky, heated atmosphere of the club. She looked around, searching for Nathaniel, for Serafina, for any sign of where they might have gone. She saw them, running down the street, hand in hand, disappearing around a corner. She started to follow them, but then she stopped. She remembered Nathaniel's note, his warning. "Don't follow me. It's too dangerous."
He was right.
She couldn't follow him. Not yet. She would only endanger him further, make it easier for the man from military intelligence to track him down. She had to find another way, a safer way, to help him. She thought of Arthur Davies, the man from the bookstore, the man who seemed to know so much about the conspiracy, about the secrets that Nathaniel was trying to expose. He was her only hope, her only connection to the truth. She turned and ran in the opposite direction, towards the Seine, towards the bookstore, towards the only person who might be able to help her save Nathaniel from the clutches of his enemies. She had to find Arthur Davies, and she had to find him fast. As she ran, she heard the sound of sirens in the distance, growing closer, the wail of the police cars a stark reminder of the danger she was in, of the forces that were arrayed against her and Nathaniel. She was caught in a web of intrigue, of betrayal, of deadly secrets, and she had no idea how to escape. But she wouldn't give up. She would fight for Nathaniel, for his freedom, for their future, even if it meant risking everything. She would uncover the truth, expose the conspiracy, and bring the guilty to justice. She had made a promise, a silent oath, and she would keep it, no matter the cost. She reached the bookstore, her lungs burning, her legs aching. The shop was closed, the windows dark, the door locked. She pounded on the door, her fists hitting the wood with desperate force. "Arthur! Arthur! It's Elizabeth! Please! Open up!" Her calls were met with a hollow echo. Chapter 15. In the ruins of hope, a spark ignites. Elizabeth's desperate cries went unanswered. The bookstore remained stubbornly dark and silent, a fortress of locked doors and unyielding shadows. She slumped against the door, her energy depleted, her hope dwindling. The sirens were getting closer, the net tightening around her and Nathaniel. She looked around, her eyes scanning the deserted street, searching for any sign of help, any refuge from the impending danger. Across the street, she saw a small, all-night cafe, its windows glowing with a warm, inviting light. It was a long shot, but it was the only option she had. She crossed the street, her legs heavy, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. She pushed open the door, the chime above the entrance a jarring sound in the quiet night. The cafe was sparsely populated, a few late-night stragglers nursing their drinks, lost in their own thoughts, oblivious to the drama unfolding outside. The air was thick with the smell of coffee and stale cigarettes, a familiar, comforting aroma that momentarily calmed her frayed nerves. She approached the counter, her voice hoarse and trembling. "Please," she said to the elderly man behind the counter, his face lined with wrinkles, his eyes tired but kind. "I need to use your telephone. It's an emergency." The man looked at her, his eyes assessing her disheveled appearance, her desperate expression. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded, pushing a heavy, black telephone across the counter. "Be quick," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. Elizabeth dialed the number for Arthur Davies' residence, her fingers fumbling with the rotary dial. She had memorized the number, repeating it over and over in her mind, a lifeline to hope in a sea of despair. The phone rang, once, twice, 3 times. Her heart sank with each unanswered ring. He wasn't home, or he wasn't answering. She was about to hang up, to concede defeat, when she heard a click, followed by a breathless voice. "Hello? Arthur," she cried, her voice filled with relief. "It's Elizabeth. I need your help. It's about Nathaniel." She quickly recounted the events of the evening, the confrontation at the club, the man from military intelligence, the chase, the escape. She told him about Serafina, about the evidence, about the conspiracy that threatened to destroy Nathaniel's life. Arthur listened patiently, his silence punctuated by occasional questions, his voice calm and reassuring. When she had finished, he spoke, his words measured and deliberate. "You did the right thing, Elizabeth," he said. "You got out of there. You're safe. That's the most important thing. But Nathaniel, she said, her voice trembling. He's in danger. They're hunting him. We have to do something. I know, Arthur said. And we will. But we have to be smart about this. We can't just rush in blindly. We need a plan. He paused, then added, meet me tomorrow morning. At the Notre Dame Cathedral. At sunrise. We'll talk there. We'll figure out what to do. Elizabeth felt a surge of hope, a renewed sense of determination. Arthur Davies was her ally, her confidant, her guide in this treacherous world of secrets and lies. He would help her save Nathaniel. She knew it. Thank you, Arthur, she said, her voice filled with gratitude. Thank you for everything. Just be careful, Elizabeth, he said. And don't trust anyone. Not until you see me. She hung up the phone, feeling a slight sense of relief, a momentary reprieve from the overwhelming fear that had consumed her. She thanked the cafe owner, offering to pay for the call, but he waved her away, his eyes filled with a mixture of sympathy and understanding. She stepped out of the cafe, into the cold night air. The sirens were still audible, but they were fading, moving away from her, towards another part of the city. She had a few hours, a brief window of opportunity, to rest, to regroup, to prepare for the meeting with Arthur. She found a small, unassuming hotel near the river, a place where she could blend in, disappear amongst the anonymous travelers and weary souls who sought refuge in its dimly lit rooms. She paid for a room, using the last of her francs, and collapsed on the bed, fully clothed, her mind racing, her body exhausted. She closed her eyes, trying to sleep, but her thoughts were a chaotic jumble of images and emotions. Nathaniel's face, Seraphina's song, the man with the gun, Arthur Davies's voice, they swirled around in her mind, a relentless vortex of fear and hope. She drifted in and out of a fitful sleep, haunted by nightmares of chases and escapes, of betrayals and revelations. She dreamed of Nathaniel, of his smile, of his touch, of the love they shared, a love that was threatened by forces beyond their control. As the first rays of dawn filtered through the curtains, she woke up, her body stiff and sore, her mind still reeling from the events of the night. She looked out the window, at the rising sun painting the sky with hues of pink and gold, a breathtaking spectacle of beauty and serenity that seemed to mock the turmoil within her. She had to get to Notre Dame. She had to meet Arthur Davies. She had to save Nathaniel. The cathedral, in the early morning light, appeared more damaged than she remembered. But still, it stood. Chapter 16. The masks we wear, the truths we hide. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of the Seine and the promise of a new day, a day that held both hope and peril for Elizabeth. Notre Dame, even in its partially damaged state, stood majestically against the brightening sky, a symbol of resilience, of faith, of enduring strength. It was a fitting place to meet Arthur Davies, a man who seemed to embody those same qualities. Elizabeth arrived early, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. She found a quiet spot near the entrance, away from the few early morning worshippers and tourists, her eyes scanning the surrounding area, searching for any sign of Arthur or of any potential threats. She didn't have to wait long. He appeared, seemingly out of nowhere, his familiar tweed jacket and neatly trimmed mustache a reassuring sight in the vast, imposing space of the cathedral. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice low and calm, his eyes filled with concern. "You look tired. Did you sleep at all?" "Not much," she admitted. I was too worried about Nathaniel." "I understand," he said. "But we have to focus. We have to be strong. We have a lot to do." He led her to a secluded alcove, a small, private space hidden behind a massive stone pillar, where they could talk without being overheard. "I've been doing some investigating," he said, his voice low and conspiratorial. "I've made some inquiries. And I've discovered some disturbing information." He paused, then added, "The man from military intelligence, he's not just a simple officer. He's a high-ranking official. A man with connections to the very top." Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. This was worse than she had feared. Nathaniel wasn't just facing a rogue element within the military, he was facing a powerful, entrenched conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government.
Who is he?
She asked, her voice trembling. Arthur Davies hesitated, his gaze searching her face, as if assessing her trustworthiness. His name is General Du Bois, he said. He's a ruthless, ambitious man. He's the one who orchestrated the cover-up at Passchendaele. He's the one who's trying to silence Nathaniel. General Du Bois. The name struck a chord, a discordant note in Elizabeth's mind. Du Bois, Serafina Du Bois, was it a coincidence? Or was there a connection? Du Bois, she said, her voice questioning. Is he related to Serafina? Arthur Davies looked at her, his eyes widening slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. How did you know? He asked.
It was just a guess, she said.
The brooch, the serpent brooch, I saw it on both of them. Arthur Davies nodded, his expression grim. Yes, he said. They are related. Serafina is his daughter. Elizabeth felt a wave of shock wash over her. Serafina, Nathaniel's former lover, the woman who held the key to his freedom, was the daughter of his enemy, the man who was trying to destroy him. It was a cruel twist of fate, a betrayal of trust, a revelation that shattered her fragile hope. She set a trap for Nathaniel with her song. At the club, Elizabeth said. Arthur shook his head. No, she is helping him. The song was coded. A warning and a message. She has been playing a double game. But she is in great danger. He paused. The general knows about the evidence Nathaniel has. The general believes Serafina gave it to him. Arthur continued, his tone urgent. We must find them. Before the general does. Elizabeth struggled to come to terms with this new information. A plan was needed, a very careful, well-executed plan. But how? Elizabeth asked, feeling overwhelmed. They know about the evidence. He knows everything. Not everything, Arthur corrected. He handed Elizabeth a small, folded piece of paper. Elizabeth looked at the paper. It was an address. And a time. Chapter 17. A rendezvous at the midnight hour. The address was for a small, unassuming antique shop in the Marais district, a place known for its hidden courtyards, its winding alleyways, its secrets. The time was midnight, the witching hour, a time for clandestine meetings, for whispered conversations, for desperate measures. What is this? Elizabeth asked, her voice filled with confusion.
It's a rendezvous, Arthur said.
A meeting place. Serafina arranged it. She wants to help Nathaniel. She wants to expose her father. Elizabeth felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Relief that Serafina was, seemingly, on their side. But also suspicion, a lingering doubt that wouldn't quite disappear. Could she truly trust the daughter of General Du Bois, the man who was hunting Nathaniel, the man who had orchestrated the cover-up at Passchendaele? Why should we trust her? Elizabeth asked, her voice hesitant. She's his daughter. She could be leading us into a trap. Arthur Davies nodded, his expression understanding. I know, he said. It's a risk. A big risk. But it's the only chance we have. She has the evidence, the proof that can clear Nathaniel's name, that can expose the conspiracy. He paused, then added, she loves him. She still loves him. She wants to make amends for the past. She wants to protect him. Elizabeth felt a pang of jealousy, a sharp, unexpected pain that she quickly suppressed. This wasn't about her feelings. This was about Nathaniel, about his life, his freedom. She had to put aside her personal emotions, her doubts, her fears, and focus on the task at hand. What's the plan? She asked, her voice firm, her resolve hardening. We go to the antique shop, Arthur said. We meet Serafina. We get the evidence. And then we expose the truth. We bring General Du Bois and his cronies to justice. It sounded simple, straightforward, but Elizabeth knew it wouldn't be easy. They were walking into a dangerous game, a web of deceit and betrayal, and they had no idea who they could trust, who was on their side, who was working against them. We have to be careful, she said. We have to assume that everyone is a potential enemy. Arthur Davies nodded. We will be, he said. I have contacts. People who can help us. People who owe me favors. He smiled, a grim, determined smile that sent a shiver down Elizabeth's spine. We're not alone in this, Elizabeth, he said. There are others who want to see justice done, who wanted to end the corruption, the lies, the betrayal. They left the cathedral, stepping out into the bright sunlight, a stark contrast to the shadowy interior where they had made their plans. They walked in silence, their minds racing, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. They spent the day preparing, gathering information, making contacts, laying the groundwork for their midnight rendezvous. Arthur Davies, it turned out, was a man of considerable influence, a man with connections in unexpected places, a man who knew how to navigate the treacherous world of Parisian politics and intrigue. As the day wore on, Elizabeth's anxiety grew. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that they were walking into a trap, that their every move was being monitored by General Dubois and his agents. She thought of Nathaniel, of his courage, his determination, his unwavering belief in justice. She had to be strong for him, for herself, for the future they both dreamed of. As midnight approached, they made their way to the Marais district, their footsteps echoing in the quiet, deserted streets. The antique shop was easy to find, its windows filled with dusty relics and forgotten treasures, its entrance shrouded in darkness. They waited, hidden in the shadows of a nearby alleyway, their eyes fixed on the shop, their senses on high alert. The minutes ticked by, slowly, agonizingly, each one stretching into an eternity. Then, a figure emerged from the darkness, a woman, her face hidden by a wide-brimmed hat, her body wrapped in a long, dark coat. It was Serafina. She looked around, her eyes scanning the street, searching for any sign of danger. She saw them, a flicker of recognition in her eyes. She approached them, her movements quick and decisive. You came, she said, her voice low and urgent. I wasn't sure if you would trust me. We're here, Arthur Davies said. We're ready. Serafina nodded.
Good, she said.
Because we don't have much time. She held out a small, leather-bound package. The evidence. Chapter 18. The Knife's Edge of Decision. As Serafina held out the package, the dim light from a nearby street lamp glinted off, something metallic tucked into her sleeve. A small, Derringer pistol, barely visible, but undeniably present. It was a subtle warning, a reminder that she was prepared to defend herself, to fight for what she believed in. Elizabeth felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Relief that Serafina had the evidence. Apprehension about the danger that still lurked, the threat that hung heavy in the air. And a grudging respect for this woman, this complex, enigmatic figure who had risked everything to help Nathaniel. Take it, Serafina said, her voice firm, her eyes meeting Elizabeth's. It's all there. Everything you need to expose my father. To clear Nathaniel's name. Elizabeth reached out, her hand trembling slightly, and took the package. It felt heavy, weighty, the burden of truth contained within its leather binding. Thank you, Elizabeth said, her voice filled with gratitude. You're very brave. Serafina smiled, a sad, bittersweet smile that hinted at the pain she had endured, the sacrifices she had made. It's not bravery, she said. It's redemption. I owe him this. I owe him everything. She looked at Arthur Davies, her eyes searching his face. Where is he? She asked. Where is Nathaniel? Arthur Davies hesitated, his gaze shifting to Elizabeth, a silent question passing between them. Should they tell her? Could they trust her completely? Elizabeth nodded, her decision made. They needed Serafina, her knowledge, her connections, her courage. They had to trust her, even if it was a risk. He's safe, Arthur Davies said.
For now.
But he's being hunted. Your father, he won't stop until he finds him, until he silences him. Serafina's expression hardened, her eyes flashing with anger. I know, she said.
He's obsessed.
He's lost all sense of decency, of honor. She paused, then added, we have to get this evidence to the right people. To someone who can expose him. To someone who can bring him to justice. I have contacts, Arthur Davies said. People in the government, in the military, in the press. People who are not afraid of your father. People who believe in the truth. But we have to be careful, Serafina said. My father, he has eyes and ears everywhere. He knows everything that happens in this city. She looked at Elizabeth, her eyes filled with a warning.
He knows about you, she said.
He knows you're helping Nathaniel. He's looking for you too. Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. She was a target now, just like Nathaniel, caught in the crosshairs of a powerful, ruthless enemy. We have to move quickly, Arthur Davies said. We have to get this evidence to my contacts before it's too late. He outlined his plan, a daring, intricate scheme that involved secret meetings, coded messages, and a network of trusted allies. It was a risky plan, a gamble, but it was the only chance they had. As they talked, Elizabeth noticed a figure lurking in the shadows across the street. A man, his face obscured by the darkness, his body hidden by a long, dark coat. He was watching them, his gaze fixed on their group, his presence menacing and unsettling. She nudged Arthur Davies, her voice low and urgent. Look, she whispered. Across the street. Someone's watching us. Arthur Davies followed her gaze, his expression hardening. He recognized the man, the silhouette, the stance. It was one of General Du Bois's men, a loyal henchman, a ruthless killer. We have to go, he said.
Now.
He's alerted the others. They're coming. They turned to leave, but it was too late. A group of men emerged from the darkness, surrounding them, blocking their escape. They were armed, their faces grim, their intentions clear. At the head of the group stood General Du Bois himself, his face contorted with rage, his eyes blazing with hatred. So, he said, his voice cold and menacing. The traitor, the whore, and the meddling old fool. You thought you could outsmart me? You thought you could expose me? He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed in the narrow street. You're all going to pay for your insolence. You're all going to die. Serafina stepped forward, her hand reaching for the pistol hidden in her sleeve. Father, she said, her voice trembling but firm. Don't do this. It's not too late. You can still stop this madness. General Du Bois sneered. Silence, you ungrateful child, he said. You betrayed me. You chose that weakling, that coward, over your own family, over your own blood. He raised his hand, signaling his men to attack. Elizabeth braced herself for the inevitable, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. The end. Suddenly, a shot rang out. But not in the way expected. Chapter 19. Beyond the barricades of fear. The shot did not come from General Du Bois's men, nor from Serafina's hidden pistol. It came from behind Elizabeth and Arthur, from the shadows of the alleyway they had just left. A figure emerged, silhouetted against the faint light, holding a smoking gun. It was Nathaniel. He had followed them, despite his own warning, despite the danger. He couldn't stay away, he couldn't abandon Elizabeth, he couldn't let them face General Du Bois and his men alone. His shot had found its mark. One of General Du Bois's men crumpled to the ground, clutching his shoulder, his weapon clattering on the cobblestones. The others hesitated, momentarily stunned by the unexpected intervention. Nathaniel! Elizabeth cried, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and terror.
Run!
Nathaniel shouted, his voice echoing in the narrow street. Get out of here! I'll hold them off. He fired again, another shot finding its mark, another man falling to the ground. The remaining men scattered, seeking cover, returning fire, the alleyway erupting in a cacophony of gunfire and shouts. Arthur Davies grabbed Elizabeth's arm, pulling her towards a narrow passage, a hidden escape route that led to a maze of interconnected courtyards. Come on, he yelled. We have to go.
Now.
Serafina joined them, her face pale but determined, her pistol still in her hand. She knew the back streets of the Marais like the back of her hand. She knew the hidden passages, the secret exits, the places where they could disappear. They ran, blindly, desperately, their lungs burning, their legs aching, the sounds of gunfire echoing behind them. They navigated the labyrinthine alleyways, twisting and turning, dodging obstacles, their pursuers hot on their heels. Elizabeth glanced back, saw Nathaniel still standing his ground, firing at General Dubois's men, holding them back, buying them time to escape. He was a lone figure, silhouetted against the chaos, a symbol of courage, of defiance, of unwavering love. "We have to go back," she cried, her voice filled with anguish. "We can't leave him. He'll be killed." "He knows what he's doing," Arthur Davies said, his voice grim but firm. "He's a soldier.
He's trained for this.
He'll find a way to escape. We have to get the evidence to safety. That's what he wants. That's what matters." Serafina nodded in agreement, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination.
"He's right," she said.
"We have to honor his sacrifice. We have to finish what he started." They continued to run, their hearts pounding in their chests, their minds racing, their emotions a chaotic jumble of fear, guilt, and a desperate hope that Nathaniel would somehow survive. They finally reached a safe house, a small, nondescript apartment above a bakery, a place where Arthur Davies had arranged for them to hide, to regroup, to plan their next move. They collapsed on the floor, exhausted, breathless, their bodies trembling with adrenaline and fear. They were safe for the moment, but they knew it wouldn't last. General Dubois would be relentless. He would stop at nothing to find them, to retrieve the evidence, to silence them forever. Elizabeth looked at the leather-bound package, still clutched in her hand, the weight of truth, of justice, pressing down on her. She had to get this evidence to the right people, to someone who could expose General Dubois, to someone who could bring him to justice. She looked at Arthur Davies, at Serafina, her unlikely allies, her companions in this desperate fight. They were all that stood between tyranny and truth, between darkness and light. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice trembling but firm. Arthur Davies took a deep breath, steeling himself for the task ahead. "We fight," he said. "We fight for Nathaniel. We fight for justice. We fight for the future." He outlined his plan, a final, desperate gamble, a plan that would either expose the conspiracy and bring down General Dubois, or lead to their own destruction. It was a plan that required courage, cunning, and an unwavering belief in the power of truth. Elizabeth looked at Serafina, the two women's eyes meeting. They were no longer strangers. They were allies now, a bond forged, and they would not fail. Chapter 20. The Reckoning of Love and Duty. The plan was audacious, bordering on reckless. Arthur Davies, using his network of contacts, arranged a meeting with a prominent journalist, a man known for his integrity, his courage, and his willingness to expose corruption, no matter the cost. The meeting was to take place at a neutral location, a small, unassuming cafe near the Luxembourg Gardens, a place where they could blend in with the crowd, where they could talk without being overheard. Elizabeth, Serafina, and Arthur Davies arrived separately, taking different routes, avoiding the main thoroughfares, sticking to the back alleys and the less traveled paths. They were taking every precaution, knowing that General Dubois's men were still searching for them, that their every move was being watched. They sat at a table near the window, their eyes scanning the street, their senses on high alert. The journalist, a man named Monsieur Leclerc, arrived shortly after, his face lined with worry, his eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Arthur Davies introduced Elizabeth and Serafina, explaining their connection to Nathaniel, their knowledge of the conspiracy, their possession of the evidence that could bring down General Dubois. Monsieur Leclerc listened intently, his expression growing increasingly grave as he heard their story, as he examined the documents, the letters, the photographs that Serafina had provided. He saw the proof of the war profiteering, the corruption, the treason, the deliberate sacrifice of innocent lives for personal gain. "This is explosive," he said, his voice low and urgent. "This could bring down the government. This could change everything." He paused, then added, "But it's also incredibly dangerous. General Dubois, he's a powerful man. He has friends in high places. He won't hesitate to silence anyone who threatens him." "We know," Arthur Davies said.
We're prepared to take that risk.
We have to expose the truth. We have to bring him to justice. Monsieur Leclerc nodded, his expression determined.
I'll help you, he said.
I'll publish the story. I'll expose this conspiracy to the world. But just as they were finalizing their plans, a sudden commotion erupted outside the cafe. A group of men, dressed in civilian clothes but with the unmistakable bearing of military police, stormed into the cafe, their guns drawn, their faces grim. There they are, one of them shouted, pointing at Elizabeth, Serafina, and Arthur Davies. Arrest them. They're traitors. They're enemies of the state. The cafe erupted in chaos. Patrons screamed, diving for cover, overturning tables and chairs in their haste to escape. Monsieur Leclerc, with surprising agility, grabbed the evidence and slipped out a back door, disappearing into the maze of narrow streets behind the cafe. Elizabeth, Serafina, and Arthur Davies were surrounded, trapped, their escape route blocked. They were at the mercy of General Dubois's men, their fates seemingly sealed. But then, a voice rang out, a familiar voice, filled with authority and defiance. Drop your weapons. The voice commanded. This is a military matter. I'm in charge here. It was Nathaniel. He had somehow escaped. He had somehow found them. And he was standing at the entrance to the cafe, his own gun drawn, his face pale but determined. He had found a small group of loyal soldiers. The military police hesitated, momentarily confused, their loyalty divided between their orders from General Dubois and the unexpected appearance of a decorated war hero. He turned and faced his accuser and, with a small group of soldiers that had rallied to him, arrested General Dubois. In the aftermath, General Dubois was court-martialed, the evidence presented, his crimes exposed. He was stripped of his rank, his honors, his power. He was sentenced to life in prison, a just punishment for his betrayal, his corruption, his cruelty. Nathaniel was exonerated, his name cleared, his reputation restored. He was hailed as a hero, a man who had risked everything to expose the truth, to bring justice to the victims of the war. Elizabeth and Nathaniel were finally reunited, their love stronger than ever, their bond forged in the crucible of danger and adversity. They had faced death, betrayal, and despair, and they had emerged victorious, their love triumphant. Serafina, her role in exposing her father's crimes acknowledged, was granted immunity from prosecution. She left Paris, seeking a new life, a new beginning, far from the shadows of her past. The lovers stood, in a quiet cemetery, at a simple grave. The headstone read, Major Nathaniel Blackwood. They thought I died a hero, Nathaniel said. He looked at Elizabeth, his eyes filled with love. But you knew I lived as a ghost. He touched her cheek. He knew the truth, the real truth of what happened at Passchendaele. And now, so did Elizabeth. She reached out her hand, touching the newly carved headstone. Epilogue. The years that followed were a tapestry woven with threads of joy and sorrow, of healing and remembrance. Elizabeth and Nathaniel settled in a small cottage in the English countryside, far from the noise and chaos of London, far from the lingering shadows of the war. They created a life filled with simple pleasures, gardening, reading, long walks in the rolling hills, quiet evenings by the fire. They never forgot the horrors they had witnessed, the sacrifices they had made, the friends they had lost. They visited the war memorials, they tended the graves of the fallen, they kept alive the memory of those who had perished in the mud and blood of Flanders. Nathaniel, though initially celebrated as a hero, eventually faded from the public eye, content to live a quiet, anonymous life, his wartime exploits a distant memory. He found solace in writing, penning his memoirs, a detailed account of his experiences, a testament to the courage and resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. He never published them, content to keep them for his family, for future generations. A reminder of the cost of war, the price of freedom. Elizabeth, too, found solace in writing, but her focus was different. She wrote about the women of the war, the nurses, the ambulance drivers, the volunteers, the women who had worked tirelessly behind the lines, tending to the wounded, comforting the dying, supporting the war effort in countless ways. She wrote about their courage, their compassion, their unwavering dedication to duty, their often unrecognized contributions to the victory. Their home became a haven for veterans, a place where they could find comfort, understanding, and a sense of belonging. They hosted gatherings, shared meals, told stories, and offered support to those who were still struggling to come to terms with the trauma of the war. They created a community of survivors, a network of healing, a testament to the enduring power of human connection. They had children, 2 sons and a daughter, who grew up surrounded by love, laughter, and the stories of their parents' extraordinary past. They instilled in them a sense of justice, of compassion, of the importance of standing up for what is right, even in the face of adversity. As the years passed, the scars of the war began to fade, both physical and emotional. Nathaniel's nightmares became less frequent, his anxieties less intense. Elizabeth's grief softened, replaced by a quiet acceptance, a profound appreciation for the life they had been given, the love they shared. They grew old together, their love deepening with each passing year, their bond unbreakable, their commitment unwavering. They had faced the darkness together, and they had emerged into the light, their love a beacon of hope in a world scarred by conflict. One crisp autumn afternoon, as the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the rolling hills, Elizabeth and Nathaniel sat on the porch of their cottage, hand in hand, watching the leaves fall from the trees, a gentle reminder of the passage of time, the cycle of life and death. Nathaniel looked at Elizabeth, his eyes filled with a love that had endured the trials of war, the passage of time, the challenges of life. He smiled, a gentle, loving smile that reached the depths of her soul. "We made it, Elizabeth," he said, his voice soft, his words a simple affirmation of their shared journey, their enduring love. Elizabeth nodded, her eyes filled with tears of joy, of gratitude, of a love that had conquered all. She squeezed his hand, her heart overflowing with a peace that surpassed all understanding. "Yes, my love," she said. "We made it." And in that moment, surrounded by the beauty of the English countryside, by the quiet serenity of their home, by the enduring power of their love, they knew that they had found their happily ever after, a peace forged in the fires of war, a love that would last in eternity. Their ghosts, finally, were at rest. The end.